particularly in young people. So this demonstrates again this revolving door mentality. Is they approach people that are in positions to get products approved that are dangerous. They use their money and influence, promise of jobs to get it approved, and then that person leaves and goes to work for the company. So the public is being deceived thinking that modern regulatory agencies are protecting them. They're not. They're protecting the people that they're supposed to regulate.
Doctor, going back to the collusion and the revolving door issues, Wolfgang Vodarg of the Council of Europe initiated an official investigation into the H1N1 vaccine, saying that it had been pharmaceutical people falsely rising the level of the pandemic and causing the WHO to, put out the mass alert and push this whole thing. Could you talk about the swine flu? I won't use the word, I'll suggest the word hoax, but of course, tell us what you think about it.
Well, I think it was a grand hoax. Now that we're looking in retrospect, the idea that it was a pandemic is being attacked by a number of people, that there was no evidence that it was a pandemic. And as I appeared on one of Alex's earlier shows when all of the H1N1 was first emerging, I had searched the CDC site. I researched things that were in one of the most prestigious of our science magazines, which is called Science, and Nature, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Early on, the evidence was that this was a very difficult virus to transmit, that its virulence was no worse than any other ordinary virus, and that this whole thing was being overblown. Then it came out by the CBS study, which they looked at all the different states and found out the vast majority of the viral infections were not H1N1. Something like 90% in some states, 99% were other viruses. And so there were very few cases actually of H1N1, which goes along with these other early studies saying it's very difficult to transmit. Well, they knew all of this. When I went through all the data that was appearing on the CDC site, the Center for Disease Control, it was showing quite clearly that the death rate from this virus at all age levels was actually quite low. At this time, they were saying, well, the most at risk are children under 4 years of age. I warned at that time, if you use the adjuvants in this vaccine that's being proposed, you're going to increase the risk of seizures and brain damage, autism and schizophrenia in these children. Well, now it's come out after the epidemic has been over, or the so-called pandemic is over, that in fact in Britain, for instance, they admit that the H1N1 vaccine has caused a tremendous increase in seizures in children under age 4, the very ones they targeted. The very ones they were telling children in America and in Europe and in the UK, you need to bring your children in to get this vaccine because they're at high risk of dying. When I looked on their site, it didn't tell that story. When I looked at their own data, it said those children really are at less risk than they were in previous years from flu. So they were lying all the time, and the media could easily have done what I did, look on the CDC site and see they were lying, but instead they carried the story that this is a pandemic, that this is scary, that you need to get your children vaccinated. And who else did they target? They targeted pregnant women. I warned them that compelling study said if you vaccinate pregnant women with this powerful adjuvant, you're going to increase the incidence of autism and schizophrenia. Well, we're not going to see the impact of the schizophrenia for a decade or more. And they'll have deniability because they know that most of the public does not know about this research. That in fact, if you do that during pregnancy, you dramatically, it's almost a 6-fold increase in schizophrenia. Now, it took 20 years or more for us to find out about the previous fake epidemic and pandemic. Or you remember the 1986 H1N1 scare that, here's the 1918 pandemic coming again. And so we went through that with the swine flu vaccine, and we had over 500 deaths, and the actual virus itself killed one person. So that means 500 times more people died from the vaccine than died from the actual virus. It took 20 years for that to come out to the public. 20 years for them to figure out that in fact the whole thing had been concocted. So it's going to take another 20 years for us to actually see the impact of what's happened this past year with H1N1. When we finally get a tally of how many mothers lost their babies, I think so far the count's about 200. How many in the end are going to end up schizophrenic? How much increase in autism will we see? How many other neurodevelopmental problems will we see? How many children will have seizures for the rest of their life? How many elderly are going to have problems, autoimmune disease, etc.? It's going to take decades for that to finally be exposed. And so, you know, that's my warning to people, is be a little bit more discerning, a little bit more skeptical when you hear these federal agencies on TV trying to terrify you into taking a course of action. And of course, when we look at the CDC, and again, people who've visited there told me all the walls are plastered with posters that are printed by the vaccine companies themselves, extolling the virtues of all of these vaccines. So the Centers for Disease Control is using their posters. If you go in your doctor's office and you see this big poster all about the virtues of these vaccines, look down in the corner and you'll see printed the name of the pharmaceutical company. So that's where your doctor's getting the information, from the pharmaceutical company. The CDC is heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical company. That's come out in a recent examination, an expose. It's that a number of these scientists are in fact receiving funds from the pharmaceutical companies. When you look at the vaccine board for the American Academy of Pediatrics, you see a number of those people are receiving funds from the pharmaceutical companies that make vaccines. Well, how can they suggest mandatory vaccinations for the CDC and for state agencies when they're receiving money from the vaccine manufacturers?